Hello. Ooh, that worked. Talking of electronic underwear, I could tell you that I'm wearing magic pants, but I'd be lying. So the good news is that we've been told that because we're the last session before lunch, we can run long and it'll be okay. So, you know, great. No, I do realize that we are holding you from lunch, so we will whistle through this. It may well be, hopefully, that what we're about to present raises some interesting questions, and obviously, you know, you can come and find us afterwards and we can talk them through. So, my name is Nick Drew. I head up research for Yahoo Canada, and Josh, who will be joining me on stage shortly, and I are here today to talk you through a piece of research that we completed and published earlier this year. We set out by wanting to understand memory and how we use technology and devices to help us remember, and how that's changing what we do and our abilities. It's, as we'll come on to, it's actually pretty interesting as research projects go. I'm sure you can all empathize when I say that not all of the work that we get to do is particularly interesting, but this one's quite cool. It's a pretty complex topic, obviously, and so we had a fairly comprehensive project to go with that. So we had a qualitative element, which we'll talk about in some detail. We had a quantitative survey with 1,500 Canadians who we spoke to in English and French. And the final part we had was neuromeasurement, which really is what kind of set this apart and made it more interesting. So we hooked people up to EEG headsets, and we saw what happened to their brains when you put them in different situations. And there are three main reasons why we did this research. The first is, quite frankly, because it's kind of cool. I don't get to do enough of this kind of work, but putting headsets on people and seeing how their brains light up when you do stuff to them, that's freaking awesome. The second one, which is unfortunately more boring, but actually more important, was that it's pretty important to Yahoo. The results really help Yahoo to tailor our products, our channels and offerings based on what we see in terms of behavior and motivation and so on. And the third reason for doing this was because it also has important implications for marketing. Marketing is the art of making consumers remember, so that when they're stood in front of a shelf going, these all look the same to me, I don't know which one I want, up in their head pops the jingle or the messaging or the specific brand association that makes them say, ooh, I want that one. And so if consumers are changing the way they remember, or if our devices are changing the way that consumers remember, this is incredibly important to marketers. So our starting point here is something that we see in a lot of research. We see it fairly consistently, we see it expressed in different ways, which is that fear of forgetting is a pretty fundamental and existential fear. Now this can range from forgetting to pick the kids up from school, forgetting your dad's birthday, but also more personal, more defining elements. So names and faces of people you've met, places you've been to, events you attended, things you like doing, even habits you have and things you know how to do are all functions of memory. Memory makes us who we are, and so the idea of losing parts of that, losing pieces of yourself, is incredibly scary, and it's something that really keeps us awake at night. And it motivates a surprising amount of our behavior day to day.
The reality is that fear around memory is completely justified. I know for myself personally, I have a horrible memory. And this isn't a joke, the older I get, the worse it becomes. That at least stems from the fact that our memories aren't perfect. I don't think it's going to take a lot of effort to convince you that it's quite flawed at the end of the day. It's nowhere near as good as a video camera at capturing moments. You can't take images and store them like you can if you have a camera. The reality is we forget things on a very regular basis. And there's three challenges that we typically face when it comes to memory. One is simply false memories. That is really your brain making things up, remembering things that never happened, at least never happened to you. One example, a rather light example, is thinking of a time that perhaps you missed a party, and it was a great party. All your friends went, all your colleagues went, your family was there. Party of the decade. And all you've heard about for the next 2 years is how awesome that party was. After a while, you start to think that you were there. You can retell all the stories. You feel like you're in the moment. though you never stepped foot at the party. That is a false memory. Another challenge that we face, and I don't want to be too stereotypical, but it tends to be a problem for males, is absent-mindedness, right? Forgetting things. You know when your wife's or husband's birthday is, but sometimes you just forget, right? You know when your anniversary is, or Valentine's Day anniversary is the same every year, but sometimes we forget. That's absent-mindedness. And last but not least is simply forgetting over time. If you don't access your memories on a regular basis, they tend to go away. So those memories from early childhood that you remembered for years and years and years, if you stop telling those stories, it can be harder to recall them. And because we were out last night with some clients, I think there may be a fourth challenge that memory faces, and it has something to do with alcohol, but I think that's for another session. We wanted to come up with a simple way to test the challenges with memory. So Nick mentioned the fact that we did an online quantitative survey, 1,500 people. We designed a very basic test to be able to look at some of the challenges on memory. And we exposed our respondents to a number of different stimulus. And we asked them to remember them. We presented them with three words. You can see them up there: apple, television, and lamb. We presented them with a fake address, a name, told them to remember that, and a series of 9 images. Those are the images that we exposed them to. We then broke up our sample into 3 different groups. And we did the memory test at 3 different stages throughout the survey. The first test was done at 2 minutes after exposure to the stimulus. And we found that they got about 8 out of 20 right. So not great. So even after 2 minutes, they'd already forgotten half of the things that we'd exposed them to. Over half, really. 10 minutes later, it was closer to 6 out of 20. And then 20 minutes later, that number was just over 5. So they'd forgotten 3/4 of what we'd exposed them to. Now, I know for myself personally, I have seen that set of stimulus, the words and the pictures, dozens of times, and I still can't remember all 20. Angelina Jolie keeps coming to mind for some reason, but that tends to be the only one I recall. This is not news to most people. Again, I didn't think it was going to take a lot of effort to convince you that our memories are challenged, and certainly when we asked Canadians what they most wanted to improve about themselves, memory was number 2 after physical appearance. Again, if you're pretty, you don't need to be smart or remember anything. But for the rest of us, we have to work on our memories a little bit. And because of that fear around forgetting, we find that being able to write down or keep track of things, creating to-do lists, go a long way in helping to alleviate a lot of the stress associated with that fear of forgetting. And that's a big reason why 9 in 10 of the people that we talk to do regularly keep track of things that they need to remember by writing them down. Technology, of course, plays a huge part in our desire to remember. There's things that I think most of us are probably using on a fairly regular basis, which is our electronic calendars these days. I know that I'd be completely lost without my calendar. Literally, I'd be staring at the wall trying to figure out what to do next. I'd have no clue what was next in my day. We use the calendars to keep track of basic things: meetings, conferences, presentations. We use it to keep track of some of the, the birthdays, the anniversaries, all the things that at least I know that I regularly forget. The calendar is a big reason why I'm not divorced currently. What else we got here? And of course, there's the alarm clock. And the alarm clock I like because it's very simple. It's been around for a long time. It's not just there to wake us up, but again, plays a huge role in reminding us of little things. When to take our medication, when to feed the dog. If you're a really busy person, perhaps when to feed the kids.
Yeah, this is why Josh is not divorced, but also has no children. The interesting thing is, as you've obviously seen this morning from the various sessions, that the technology that we use to help us remember is becoming infinitely more complex than it previously was. And in fact, there's this book that Clive Thompson, who writes for Wired, wrote last year, in which he talks about the ways that we use the capabilities of modern technology to augment our own abilities. And he articulates fantastically well this idea that we're actually on the cusp of a huge change. And we're coming from a world where essentially a lot of the details of our day-to-day lives are forgotten. So not the important stuff, not your last birthday or an amazing dinner that you had last week, but the mundane, the repetitive stuff. So the color of the carpet in your office, for example, or what you had for breakfast each day last week and what you thought of it. A lot of those details we just don't remember. And what Clive Thompson talks about in his book is that we're coming into a world with things like Google Glass where all of those details can be captured and recorded and subsequently viewed. And it raises a very interesting philosophical question, which is that we may be able to capture and record everything, but is that the same as remembering? So there are many ways, there are many illustrations of how our behavior is changing and the ways in which we now use the capabilities of technology to help us remember. The most obvious one, and arguably the one that has had the biggest impact on our day-to-day activity, is the smartphone. If you think about it, the iPhone or the Android phone you have in your pocket right now, how many phone numbers and emails email addresses do you have on there? How much of your schedule is on there? Photos, notes, to-do lists, and even, you know, if you forget where you're going after this conference, directions and so on. And it's not just how much is stored on there, but how much of it would you be able to remember if you lost your phone? We actually saw this within the qualitative work. We developed a deprivation exercise, so our 20 participants had to leave their smartphone behind for a full day. And then the following day, they had to tell us about how they got on. And what we saw, I mean, they really described fantastically well something that was at the same time fascinating, but also quite depressing, which is that we really do have an addictive relationship with our smartphones. It's like the kind of relationship we have with caffeine, or with nicotine if you're a smoker, or pudding if you're addicted to pudding. When you don't have it with you, you feel stressed, you feel slightly lost, you feel disconnected from the world around you. And what we saw was that when people get that item back, their smartphone back, they don't even really have to do anything on it to feel better, to feel more at ease with the world, like they're reconnected, like everything's okay again. We've become inseparable from our smartphones, so much so that half of smartphone-owning Canadians will admit to regularly taking their smartphone into public bathrooms and using it while they're there. So really, what we saw from the early stages of the research was that we do have issues with memory, and we are very aware of those, and that motivates a lot of our behaviors. We have become increasingly dependent on technology for shortcuts to help us remember and work around those challenges. But what we wanted to understand, and really the crux of the research, was, is technology affecting and hampering our own ability to remember? If we go back to the memory test that Josh was talking about, seemingly the only thing he remembered was Angelina Jolie, we saw that over a period of 18 minutes from our early group to our late group here, people on average forgot 28% more detail than they had after 2 minutes. The beauty of this design was that we were able to explore these numbers based on weight of use of technology, and specifically how much time people spend using their smartphone each day. So over here, over here we have our 28% decline in the sample as a whole. And then you can see over on the left here that the lightest users of smartphones, so people who didn't have smartphones or used them for less than an hour a day, performed better. They forgot less over those 18 minutes than heavier users of smartphones. And in fact, this group here of the heaviest users of smartphones, people using their phones for 5 or more hours a day on average, had forgotten more than 80% of the detail of the test by the time we came to test them 20 minutes later. So what we saw here was a pretty strong correlation suggesting that certainly the two are related. The amount of time people spend using technology is definitely related to how quickly people forget. What we didn't understand and weren't able to get from this element of the research was why that is and what's actually happening. You should stand on stage, man.
I don't want to take away from your bit. One of the things I wanted to look into that we didn't have a chance was I wanted to look at the relationship between heavy smartphone usage and the amount of times they go to the restroom. I think that would have been definitely a relationship there. We wanted to be able to get inside and dig deeper into the brain. I mean, this was really important. Nick talked about trying to understand what was going on inside, and being the researcher that I am, I literally wanted to get inside the brain. I was hoping we'd find some way to cut open the head. It's pretty twisted, but I really thought that would work. Of course, that found out that the incentives for that were a little bit cost prohibitive, so we had to find the next best thing. And what we did end up going with was and I literally can't say this, so Nick.
Electroencephalography.
Thank you. It's more commonly known as EEG, and that I can say. Most of you has probably seen what it looks like. Think hat, headband with a bunch of sensors on it, and you put it on your head, and it reads the electrical activity taking place in your brain. What we see here is an actual output from one of the respondents that we used for the study. You can see the red color, they're glowing on the scalp, and that represents actual activity taking place in their brain. The reason why this was so good for us is because it allowed us to measure two things. One being emotional engagement, so think likability, the emotional reaction, how connected they are to whatever the visual stimulus is that we're exposing them to. The other thing we were able to measure is concentration. So think attention, how focused they are on the stimulus. The study that we designed involved exposing respondents to a couple videos. They were short, 2 minutes in length. And we instructed them to watch the videos, and we told them that they would have a test afterwards. And we would be asking them questions about what they saw in the video, essentially a little memory test on the video themselves. With half of the group, though, we also told them that they'd be allowed to use their smartphone to take photos, not video, but still photos of the video that they were watching, and that they'd be able to reference those photos during the memory test to help them answer the questions. So half, no phone, watch video, do a test. The other half, use their phone, take pictures, use the phone to help answer the test. We then measured the emotional engagement while they were watching the video, right? And what we see is some really interesting numbers. Is that when we look at those who are only able to watch the video, so they're not using their phones during the process, we saw a drop, a 35% drop in their emotional engagement from their average starting point. What does that mean to us? Well, it means that they did not enjoy the process very much. It was work to them. They knew there was going to be a test afterwards. They were focusing on trying to remember. It was not a pleasurable experience. Those who were able to use their phones, however, had a very different experience during the process. They were 50% higher with respect to their emotional engagement than they were before the process started. They actually had fun. This was probably a little bit easy for them. They were confident that afterwards they'd be able to use their phone and everything would be great. I think we hypothesized that that increase is not just around how relaxed they are, but Nick talked about the association, the addiction almost that we have with our phones. People seem to genuinely enjoy simply playing with their phone. So the ability to use the phone and take pictures was an enjoyable process in itself, and that helped to drive up that emotional engagement. But we also talked about concentration. And so when we looked at the levels of concentration while watching the videos, again, we see some interesting differences. Those who just watched the videos concentrated more than those who watched the videos and took pictures. Right? So it makes sense, right? They had no aids, and so they were a little bit more focused on the process. This is really important because concentration is key. Without going into too much detail, when we are exposed to things, you need to be able to concentrate, to be able to put it into your long-term memory. And your ability to put it into your long-term memory is key in terms of your ability to recall that memory at a later point.
And so when we came to test their recall of the videos that they watched, we found a couple of interesting things. First thing we saw was that on average, people who just watched the video without any concurrent activity got 50% of the questions right. And perhaps unsurprisingly, those people who took a photo and looked at it to help them do the test did slightly better. Not significantly better in the test, but slightly, enough to see that uplift. But we were sneaky, or researchers, depending how you like to describe these things. We didn't let everyone who took a photo refer to it when they did the test. So within our test group, we had a subgroup who, when they watched the video, they took a photo with their smartphones, and then we took their phones off them and told them that they still had to do the test. And what we saw was that they performed significantly worse at remembering the details of the videos that they'd seen. The process of watching the video and taking a photo had made the task more enjoyable, but they'd been distracted, they hadn't paid as much attention, and this showed when it came to actually testing their memory and their recall of what they'd seen. The other really intriguing thing that we saw, although we haven't charted it up here, was that when we came to measure their emotional engagement when they recounted the video to us, when they told us about what they'd seen, those people who had taken the photos, regardless of whether they were able to refer to them afterwards, didn't enjoy telling us about the videos in the same way as those people who had just watched the videos and concentrated more. So the experience of reliving that memory was less enjoyable and less engaging for them because they had taken those photos. So there's some really intriguing elements here and something, to some extent, validating, I think, what we perhaps might expect to see, that the process of taking a photo, mentally on some level, we switch off. We feel that we've captured the moment. We don't actually need to pay attention as much anymore because we already have it and we can go back to that if necessary. But really, we saw this difference that demonstrates that that isn't the same as memorizing things or remembering things ourselves. And it's pretty fascinating stuff. So like I said, I mean, there's a lot of implications, a lot of corollaries. To be honest, there's an absolute stack of data behind this, but I'll just skip on to some of the implications. Pulling it all together, I think it's useful to go back to the title of the research. So the 0 moment of memory, which when I first jotted it down, I was thinking of that brief moment, that nanosecond, when consciously or unconsciously, you decide whether you're going to make an effort to remember something yourself or whether you're going to delegate it and record it somewhere. So if you think about going to work in the morning and your partner or significant other says to you, can you get some milk on the way home? And you have that brief moment where you think, am I going to put a calendar reminder in? Am I going to write a note to myself? Or am I just going to make an effort to remember? And what we can see is that technology is changing that decision for us. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we chose differently. We didn't have the same choices. We didn't have a smartphone with us that could record every element of our schedule. We didn't have the ability to record everyone's phone number and email address in a device at the touch of a button. So we are changing the way that we remember and recall things. And it has both costs and benefits. A benefit is that we are arguably much more efficient. I don't know how many phone numbers each of you can remember now, but I'm going to guess at 3 or fewer. And yet, with your smartphone in your pocket, you have hundreds of phone numbers available at the touch of a button. The downside is that we can actually see that we are remembering less ourselves. Compare how many phone numbers you can remember right now to how many you could remember 15 years ago. We are definitely losing out, both in terms of the detail that we can recall, and also in how we experience memories as well. This idea that when we come back to them, they are less engaging if we have captured them and recorded them somewhere. It does have some interesting implications that tie in quite neatly with the preceding couple of sessions, and really kind of gives us some pointers of where consumer technology, amongst other things, is likely to go over the next 5 years or so. So through the research, we can actually see why the cloud has become so important to consumers and how it will continue to grow in importance. Because fear of forgetting has become fear of losing our data, of losing those records, photos, phone numbers, and so on. We can also see that wearable technology is going to become more proactive and a larger part of our lives. So when your partner says to you, can you get some milk on the way home? Google Glass or your smartwatch or your smartphone will be able to automatically record that and pop up a reminder at the appropriate time. And there are implications about data organization as well. I'm sure that other people have described it better. But the amount of data that we are creating and storing is growing exponentially. And so being able to retrieve elements of our Google Glass video recording of our day by time of day, where you were, what you were thinking, is going to become incredibly important. Ultimately, the implications spread and stretch across Yahoo and our products. They stretch across marketing strategies for brands and even to us as individuals and how we live day to day. What ties them all together, though, is that memory relies on engagement. In order to remember something, we have to pay attention to it. We have to process it and encode it. And so we see for marketers, for example, that while it is probably a good thing to encourage people to click on an ad or like something on Facebook or take a photo of your brand, we have to ask whether that's actually leading to memory. whether people are processing and encoding it, or whether they're just clicking and forgetting. Arguably, it's something of a wake-up call, and brands really need to think about drawing consumers in, developing experiences that encourage consumers to actually engage, think about what they're seeing, to build that memory for later. And I think there's something here for us as individuals as well. We've seen that we are becoming more efficient at recording and recalling things. Outlook, iPhones, taking photos of everything that we see are making us more efficient at remembering things as and when we need them. But it does come with this cost. We don't remember as much ourselves. And ultimately, I think where we end up with is kind of a philosophical point, to be honest, that recording something is not the same as remembering it, and capturing a moment is not the same as experiencing the moment. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't kept you from your lunch for too long. Obviously, thanks to Josh as well.